Welcome to The Classical Mind, a podcast about the great books in the Western canon. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
And I'm Dr. Junius Johnson.
Junius, it's been a while since we've been able to record. How are you doing these days?
I am swamped, I am busy, and I am good.
Yes. The school year has started, which I think
Yeah.
is a large reason why it was difficult to find the time to record. That first month of school is always a big adjustment. So,
That's right.
yeah, absolutely. I assume you're teaching a lot of classes through your website.
Teaching a fair number, but the teaching load isn't too terrible. I'm really enjoying it. I'm teaching a few courses for the first time, and so there's more preparation involved in that. And then just trying to close off some other non-teaching projects that I really want to have done by the end of the year. So it's one of those seasons where you're pushing really hard for a finish line, and you can see it right there. So you push harder, but there's still a lot of ground to cover.
Sure. Awesome. Well, we are here to talk about what might be my least favorite book that we've read on the Classical Mind so far, which is Thus Spake Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. And this was one of your picks.
It's clearly your least favorite book that you've done on the Classical Mind so far, right?
Yeah, I think it is my least favorite book that we've done.
I mean, it might be your least favorite book of all time, mightn't it?
Yeah, it would be hard to think. I mean, maybe something explicitly like Mein Kampf might be my least favorite book. But I mean, this is pretty close.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, in fact, corporate wants you to see the difference between these two pictures.
That's right. This is really the prequel to Mein Kampf.
That's right. Everybody hates a prequel. Yeah. So why don't we start just by giving a little background as to why you picked this? This is also the last book of our current season.
That's right.
So what was behind the selection to pick a book like this, which does not necessarily go along with some of the other works that we've read? Very well.
In other words, to defend the fact that I've inflicted this book upon you and any other readers who are foolish enough to try to follow in our wake.
Exactly.
I think that's fair. I picked it really for the main reason. I guess I picked it for two reasons. One is that I did want us to interact with some Nietzsche. He is someone who has been deeply and terribly influential in the 20th century, and yet is often avoided by folks just because it's hard to get a handle on what to do with him. It's hard to know how to read him. He's asking for a different kind of reading than we normally give, and he's sort of making, blaming you if you don't want to give it to him. And I just feel like it's important to let the madman speak, and before we put him away on the shelf, right? So I did want us to interact with his thought, and so I picked this work because I felt like it was the most concentrated Nietzsche thought that there was. You get access to all of his biggest ideas come out in this work, but also the manner of delivery is maybe a bit more accessible than just reading one of some of his more straight philosophy books that can get a little strident, actually. So yeah, I think it's one of the most important devilish books out there. I do think it's a fairly demonic book. We will not be reading any passages from the book because if we read aloud from Thus Spake Zarathustra, it actually will summon the spirit of Nietzsche from the grave and he will rise again. And so we must not, sort of like a mummy type situation, we can't read aloud from the book. And that's a joke. But yeah, no, it's as I was saying to you before we started, I've rarely read someone with whom I disagree so thoroughly. I don't know that I've ever read anyone with whom I disagree more thoroughly than with Nietzsche. And yet he can be kind of fun to fight with.
Oh yeah.
And so I brought him in front of us so we can understand the monster before we lock it away in the deepest darkness for all time.
I think that is fair. I think I agree with you. It's important that we engage, and the goal of this podcast is to engage with all sorts of works that are in the Western canon, and this is certainly an important one, even if it is incredibly depressing. I joke with my parishioners. A couple sermons I preached recently, the readings have kind of lended themselves to think about it this way, and I've been reading this book as I've been preaching, and so I've a couple times said that Nietzsche is my favorite atheist. Because he so clearly understands the fault lines, and if you give into certain contentions that Christianity supports, you are to escape Christianity becomes disingenuous.
Yeah.
So you think about modern atheists today, like the new atheists, like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, and they all love certain virtues like tolerance and kindness and all these things, and that comes from a Christian understanding of the world. Those are Christian virtues. They want them hollowed out. They don't want the spiritual stuff to go along with it, but it's like Dawkins even recently said, well, I'm a cultural Christian.
Right.
Well, Nietzsche certainly rejects that full-throated explicitly, and and can then be a good interlocutor because he understands the debate where the actual clash points are. And so you can't just say, well, I don't want Christianity, but I also like to care for the poor, and I want to see the world be better, and I want to see different people accepted and these kind of things. Well, no, those are Christian principles that you're trying to apply just without Christianity. And we're going to see an experiment coming in the next few months of an atheistic thinker who does do that, I think, with Marx in a way, tries to take a lot of Christian thought and apply it in a sort of immediate sense rather than an eschatological sense. And so anyways, that's a whole other thing. So I think this will pair very interestingly with that book that we'll do in a couple months with the Communist Manifesto.
That's right. Yeah. And it is really, I will say that he's the only honest atheist, but I think he is the most honest atheist.
Yes.
Right. And so he's not trying to have his cake and eat it too. He understands that cake is right out, right? You just can't have any cake. And so he's trying to retrain his palate to think that he shouldn't want cake in the first place. There's an aspect of Nietzsche that I think is really fascinating. And one of the things that I think we have to get on the table, because I do think it's not irrelevant to evaluating his thought, is that he does go insane at the end of his life. Like quite stark raving mad, you might say. And there are signs of it for at least a decade before it really, explodes into full-blown insanity. And you kind of wonder, right? I mean, if the continual gazing upon the type of abyss that his philosophy describes might not have been not entirely healthy for his mind. So readers, be careful with this book. The other thing, though, is it would be different if Nietzsche had said these things and the 20th century hadn't happened. Right? Like if we still had Thus Spake Zarathustra, but the 20th century had been more like the 17th century, then I wouldn't have picked this book to read. I wouldn't think we'd need to look at it. But the reality is, if we want to understand the existential nausea that Western culture was experiencing and living through and grappling with for the 20th century, we're going to have to look at this book, because this is really where a lot of the sort of backstops that were in place intellectually to keep you from going as deep into despair as you needed to once you had jettisoned transcendence and ultimates and things like that were done away with by Nietzsche's philosophy. And this subsequent cultural collapse into despair, I think really was, I wouldn't say it's Nietzsche's fault, but I think that as history went, he played an important role in that happening.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So maybe we could start with a very basic and probably one of the more common things that Nietzsche is known for, which is this idea of the death of God.
Yeah,
of course, is a line from this book, and I want to read one section. Hopefully, it won't conjure anything up too wicked, but I think this is even more telling than just his declaration that God is dead. This is in part 2, in the section on of the Fortunate Isles. He says that God is a thought that makes all straight things crooked and puts all standing things in a spin. What are we to imagine, time gone and all transient things a mere lie? To think this is a whirling, dizzying experience for human bones and sets the stomach heaving. Truly, I call it the spinning sickness to conjecture any such thing. I call it evil and misanthropic. All this teaching of the one and the perfect and unmoved and entire unto itself and everlasting. Anything everlasting is no more than an image, and the poets tell too many lies. I circled the line where he said, I call it evil and misanthropic, and in the margins commented, I'd say the same thing about you.
Yeah. That's spot on. So good. So I think it's very important to understand what he is and is not saying about the death of God, because I think that there is a way in which the trajectories of modernism and postmodernism can be succinctly summed up by two different responses to Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead. Right. And it's this: the modernism hears Zarathustra come down from the mountain and say God is dead, and it interprets that to mean that God has died. And so it interprets that in terms of a loss, right? We're missing something. There's a hole in the center of reality where something used to be but isn't there anymore. And so there's this great experience of loss and detachment and aimlessness and all these other sorts of things. And that's really the modern nausea. I don't believe that's what Nietzsche intended you to think. That's what he intended you to hear. What he meant to say was the idea of God is dead. That means it no longer, that idea, which never represented a reality in the first place, no longer has control over us, no longer has power over us. And so being freed from the chains of the belief in some sort of a God, we ought to be able to celebrate and go forward joyfully. Right? He calls the book of his that's variously translated as the Gay Science or the Happy Knowledge or whatever else. The happy knowledge is the knowledge that God is dead, and therefore rejoice. Therefore, we don't have to obsess about what God thinks of us and what God might do to us and these sorts of things. And postmodernism sort of returns to Nietzsche and picks up that thread that wasn't noticed by modernism and attempts to run with that. Now, both fall on their faces, but one of the reasons that modernism, I think, failed to pick up the thread as Nietzsche intended it is because this book, for example, doesn't display the sort of wild rejoicing that he seems to think that the idea of the death of God ought to beget. It feels a lot more like the modernist despair, and Zarathustra is haunted and tormented by these ideas that he's having.
Yeah, I think you're right to point that out. I think it's kind of a multivalent claim that he makes when he says that God is dead. There is that kind of loss. I think there is our lack of belief, almost like the idea of God is sort of like Tinkerbell, the more we believe in him, the more that there's a sort of power that it holds over us. But then there is this kind of opportunity to then escape the world's foundation for morality. And so then there comes a need for a kind of self-realization, which he'll describe later. But I do think it's interesting to pair what he says there in book 2 a little bit with what he says towards the end of part 1, which he actually has a moment where he talks about Jesus. And he says, truly, that Hebrew honored by the preachers of slow death died too early. And the fact that he died too early has proved fateful for many ever since. He knew as yet only the tears and melancholy of the Hebrew and the hatred of the good and just, the Hebrew Jesus, but then he was overcome by a longing for death. If only he had remained in the wilderness far from the good and just, perhaps he would have learnt to live and learnt to love the earth and to laugh too. Believe me, my brothers, he died too early. He himself would have recanted his teaching if he had lived to my age. He was noble enough to recant, but he was still immature. A youth loves immaturity, and he hates humankind and the earth immaturely as well. His nature and the wings of his spirit are still bound and heavy.
Yeah,
which I think is interesting.
that's so clever. I mean, that's really really good. It's really awful and it's really good.
Yeah,
I think we need to explain what he means by when he keeps referring to God and Jesus and Christianity as being misanthropic and as hating the human, because this is something that feels like a non sequitur a lot of times. The idea is this, and he makes this point in other works, that what he hopes to accomplish with his philosophy is what he calls the transvaluation of values, which means flipping all the values, what the value of everything is. He believes that Christianity's big mistake is that it's called good everything that's evil, and it's called evil everything that's good. And so if you look at a Christian morality, that is exactly the opposite of the way things should be. And his goal, the goal of his philosophy, is to turn that back on its head. And so he actually uses the term Antichrist of his philosophy, because he believes that Christ is the great evil, and so the Antichrist would be the savior who would free us from this. Okay, is this just wishful thinking? Is this just he wants to be able to live a life of pleasure and license, and that's what's going on there? Well, maybe, but that's not how it comes across in the works. The idea is what is properly human is this thing we're going to have to talk about in a moment, the will to power. And Christianity says the will to power is evil, and instead what you need is humility. You need self-abnegation and self-effacement, right? You need to renounce power, and he feel like this is fundamentally contrary to what the human is. The human is the result of an evolutionary emergence. We've clawed our way out of the mess of mediocrity to stand as the lords of the earth. And at the time that Nietzsche's writing, all the Darwinian stuff is new. It hasn't taken hold in the sense that Darwinism is the way to understand evolution. Nietzsche is reading other German writers who are putting forward different notions of how to think about biological development. And one of those is a purposive notion, which is absent in Darwin, that there's actually some drive inside of the creatures that causes them to transcend themselves and reach the next stage of evolutionary development. And so for Nietzsche, what is characteristically human as opposed to the monkeys and the slimes and everything else is that we are the ones who have succeeded in lifting ourselves out of mediocrity and attaining rationality. And anything that would deny that impulse, while it may claim to be the salvation of humans, is actually the destruction of humans, because it's asking us to turn against our own nature, to deny our own nature. Right? These are all Christian words, right? Deny yourself, die to yourself, take up your cross and follow me, right? But for Nietzsche, the sinful impulse of Genesis 3, I want to be like God apart from God, is actually the cool thing about humans and the thing that ought to be celebrated. And without it, we'll never arrive at the next stage of things, which is the Superman.
Yeah, yeah. There's also a sense in which I do think that Nietzsche maybe, obviously not in his conclusion, but in his raising of the question, is in some ways realistic. And I think we rubbed up against this a little bit when we read Brothers Karamazov, right? Which is like, you look at the suffering of the peasant, or the child who's left out in the cold, and that does seem, it's very hard to find a way to say, oh yeah, that suffering really is meaningful and good, and ultimately it all works out. There's a kind of very real, like, no, that's messed up, and any religion that would tell someone like, oh, you should just take that, is not good. And of course, one of the issues is that Christianity does often get it does often take on certain political values that do lend itself to being misused and things like that. But anyway, so I can kind of see his issue,
yeah,
in some way. That kind of suffering is not good, and I think as modern Westerners, we don't see it very much, so it's maybe not always the pressing question that we're asking. Whereas I think for him and for Dostoevsky, I mean, this is, I think, a very visceral wrestling with something that is legitimate to wrestle with.
Yeah.
So obviously the way he comes down is not right. But
I think that's exactly right. There's a I mean, there's a sense in which C.S. Lewis says the door of the church is low, so everyone has to stoop to get in. Right. And there's a way in which Nietzsche looks at that. He sees that low doorway. He sees that stooping. He hears the preacher saying, you've got to deny yourself. You got to die to yourself. And he asks himself the question, but why? Why should I? Right. It kind of comes down to this, right? What does human mean? Where are you going to look to locate the truth of the human? Because I get this kind of a thing all the time. I hear people saying, well, there's a famous cultural saying that we have, to err is human. Right. Never mind the second half of it. Oh, of course you made a mistake. You're only human. Obviously you're going to make a mistake because humans make mistakes. It's what humans do. The deep truth of the Christian religion is that that's not right, actually. because when you're looking at all of these humans who are failing and making mistakes and getting it wrong and accidentally killing lots of people and things like that, those guys are actually less than human. That the true human is the God man. He's the only one who had a humanity that was free from sin. And so for the first time since Adam, we get a chance to look at what is human nature actually supposed to be. And so it's denigration of the human to say that it is inherently flawed and evil and is going to make mistakes and break the world and things like that. No, that's fallen humanity. That's not humanity. Nietzsche essentially makes that mistake, right? He says the human is the fallen version of it that we see. It's just that he's taken the notion of that being a fall from some better state out of the picture. So he's kind of, a true existentialist in the sense that he takes the form in which things exist in the world as the proper form of things and then reasons from there.
Yeah.
You can see why, listeners, you can see why we're saying that he's so very honest, right? Because a lot of atheists believe that. They don't believe we've fallen from any other state and and they think this is the way humanity should be. And yet they keep bringing these other ideas into it that you don't read off of the current state of humanity, right? And compassion and kindness and self-sacrifice are not easily read off of a humanity that is a chance result of a pretty cutthroat evolutionary process.
Yes. And so we should say if the human is the fallen version that we see in the world, and that Christianity then is sort of it's not just that it's a false religion, but it's actually a mechanism of controlling the person in an unnatural way. For Nietzsche, it's unnatural.
That's right.
It's gross. And so then religion, especially Christianity, but also the state, function as kinds of chains, right, from which one has to break free. So he's got a whole thing about the state and how terrible the state is, because it wants to rein you in, it wants to keep you kind of in line and things like that. And so just like the church, I think he says the church is worse, but the state is still pretty bad, is basically his position. Because if everything that we've said about the human person is true up to this point, according to Nietzsche, the solution for him is the Superman, the Überman, the Übermensch. All these terms are often used to describe this ideal, which is the future evolution of humanity in which the person has overcome those traditional moralities and created their own values, embracing life's challenges and its uncertainties with that will to power that we've talked about. So in other words, and I think this is again where pure existentialism comes out, right? If the world is objectively meaningless, it's up to the individual person to create their own meaning what they want. And so anytime they listen to the state or the church or even just the dominant culture telling them X is what you should do or Y is what you should want, then that's a failure of the Überman. He has failed to recognize his potential. This is theosis without God, is the idea.
Yeah, it's apotheosis, right? Becoming a god and leaving something behind, leaving behind what you were before. Theosis affirms what you are. Apotheosis denies the goodness of what you were before.
Aristotle would not want us to do this.
No, he wouldn't want us to want it for our friends anyway.
Exactly.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, so all of these voices that come from outside that would tell you how to rule your life enslave you. And so any attempt to live according to some external standard is slave morality, right? I'm just going to submit myself to chains and do what I'm told and, become a sheep. That's not human. Humans aren't meant to be slaves. Humans are meant to be masters. We're meant to be lords of all we survey, to reduce things to our power. Right? What makes us human is the will to power. The notion that, and he's drawing this from an idea that's there in the German philosopher Schopenhauer, who talks a lot about will. And in Schopenhauer, he calls it the will to life, which is the thing that, you don't want to die. You choose to live. There's a strong internal natural impetus towards living that makes all living things naturally shun death. And then that explains a lot of the actions of humans that seem really weird and unusual out of context, because you're trying to survive, right? We think those other people might destroy us, so we're going to destroy them first because we want to survive, we want to live. Nietzsche, what he does is he takes up the will to life and makes that a secondary principle to the larger category of the will to power, which is just this. It's so hard to describe what the will to power, like what it's always hard to know what he thinks it is really. But what he seems to be on about is sometimes he talks about it as if it's just the pleasure in feeling powerful. I think it's the logical end. Well, I don't want to say the logical end. It's the furthest extreme of the strand of Western thought that is obsessed with freedom, right? The will to power is boundless freedom, that what you choose to have, the sort of power to have and pursue, the sort of power you would have to make sure that nothing you ever want would have to be denied to you or kept from you.
Right. I would say one thing that stuck out to me about this book is there does seem to be an emphasis on creativity in the will to power, that it is a life affirming thing. It wants to live, it wants to survive, but it's not just biological survival, it's survival in a way that kind of exerts the self or projects the self into the world.
Yes.
The way that the self wants to be projected.
Yes.
And so it does in some ways come with a certain degree of self-discipline, right? Because you if it doesn't match with whatever value you've created, it needs to be stamped out. Compassion, that feeling of compassion you have when you see someone suffering, if your goal is to be strong and to have this will to power, you have to get rid of it because it's actually slowing you down. But yeah, there's this idea of creating a meaningful life, which again makes sense, right? If there's no God, then all you're left with is nothing, kind of nihilism. And the only way to not be paralyzed by that nihilism, the only way to not to decide you want to keep living, is to have some sort of meaning that you've created that then you impose onto the world for yourself.
Yeah.
It's the only possible way to keep going.
I think that's right. There's a distinction in Nietzsche between the German word Kraft, which is power or ability, and the German word Macht, which could also be translated power, but it's a directed power, it's a shaping power. And so, you might argue the difference between Kraft and Macht is art. And Nietzsche sees himself as the successor to Wagner. And it's a wonderful place to start if you want to think about the Superman in Nietzsche is with Wagner's operas and the lead characters in those operas, Wagner's Siegfried, for instance. But yeah, so it's not simply the ability. So let's say it this way: someone today who says, I'm just living my truth, and I don't believe that anyone should have any ability to speak into my truth, and that I can just do whatever I want, whenever I want to, as the whim strikes me, is superficially Nietzschean, but they have failed to grasp the distinction between the two types of power. They are grasping onto pure ability and not onto the directedness without which you will never become the Superman, right? You don't just change in whatever direction you want. You might go back down to being a monkey if you do that. You've got to it's a directed change towards transcending yourself. Transcendence is a bad word, but sublation, right? Lifting oneself up from beneath. And so but I do think that this whole tendency in our society to sort of say that, we have total self-definition. If I want to change my name, if I want to change my gender, if I want to change my physical body and replace it with robot parts or whatever else, it's my existence. I have the power to do what I want to do with it, the power and the authority, right? Not just the ability, but also the authority to do so. I do think that's Nietzschean, but Nietzschean morality, the non-slave morality, the morality of the Superman, is not no morality at all. There is still a guide, but Nietzsche can't tell you what the morality is, because even if he knows, and he thinks he does, it seems like, if he were to tell you, then it would be transformed into slave morality for you.
Yep.
And this is why Zarathustra has to abandon his disciples and say, I'm not going to come back to you until you prove that you've renounced me, because I can't have you be Zarathustrians. You'll never become the Supermen if you're Zarathustrians.
So, two other kind of aspects of the Uberman that I think we should talk about a little bit before we move on, or maybe three, just to kind of make sure we're covering all the bases here. Is and we've already sort of alluded to this a little bit, but one of the, I think, foundations of this morality, or one of the stages of this becoming, is overcoming the self.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because we all have certain limitations, and so for Nietzsche, that it's when we talk about what are we transcending, we're transcending those limits.
Mm.
And again, this is a way in which, this is antithetical to Christianity, because Christianity would tell you that your limits make you who you are.
Yeah.
Right. So you can't do a million different things. You can't be everything. You have to pick something. So if you're a husband, that means you're a husband, and you're not a bachelor. You're not someone else's husband. You're the husband of the person that you're married to. So there's a limit there, right? And Christians would say that's a good limit.
Right.
It's good for you that you only have one spouse. It's good for you that you're married. That's a good thing. Whereas for Nietzsche, it's like, no, that's a limit. That's a box that we put ourselves in, and it needs to be overcome. These things need to be overcome, or else we're never going to reach our full potential. So there's the self-overcoming aspect. There's also the kind of love of fate that he talks about quite often. He really, it's almost stoic, sort of. It's like a kind of stoicism. It embraces every aspect of life with courage and acceptance.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. It feels at times at tension with some of his other aspects of the will to power, but
yeah.
But there is something about, like, he seems to really love the idea of like a warrior's death, and I think there's something there about, you accept it, that this is what it is. And I think it's partly because of his eternal recurrence idea, which is a very kind of hard to get into at first. So I think once you understand it, it becomes a little easier. But the eternal return, the universe and everything has been recurring and will continue to recur in a self-similar form for an infinite number of times across infinite time and space. Whether this is actually a metaphysical postulation on his, I don't think it is. I was reading it more as a psychological experiment. I don't know what you think about that, Junius, but I think it's more psychological, in that he's challenging our ability to think in terms of linear story. Because of course the Christian story is a linear story, right? Creation, fall, redemption, consummation. I mean, these are all chapters in the story, whereas this cyclical time has to reshape how we think. So everything's repeating endlessly, which means there's no real teleology to the universe.
Right.
There's no ultimate goal. There's no purpose to existence. And so at its best, I guess eternal recurrence is a way of maybe trying to overcome that paralyzing nihilism, because it encourages us to imagine what this life would look like over and over and over and over again. But I don't know. Do you think that's a right reading of that, or do you think maybe he is positing something more metaphysical in terms of the actual circularity of time?
Yeah. Gosh, you've opened up 4 cans of worms there that I want to get into. Where do I start? I will take your, okay, I'll take this one recurrence question. I do think that he probably does mean it metaphysically. I'm not sure if he's sure how committed to it he is. One of the things I think is really important about this notion is this is the terrible secret that Zarathustra has. His disciples, when they come back to him in book 2, they feel like he's holding back something, and they try to get him to tell them what it is, and he won't tell what it is. And then he gets this like taunting demon that follows him around, and he's like, okay, I'll tell him. Like, that'll be fun. I can finally tell somebody, because he doesn't want to teach this notion because he's terrified of it himself. He thinks it's the most terrible thing he's ever understood, but he believes he's rightly understood things, right? And so when it's funny, it's really hilarious in the text. He tells the demon, and you hear this dog yowling in pain, as if this, some dog somewhere has overheard the terrible secret, and it's just like broken his existence or whatever. And the terrible sequence is the eternal recurrence. So Zarathustra is struggling with it here, And I think that that's an image of the author himself trying to make sense of, what do I do with this? How seriously do I mean this? So he may have meant it more and less seriously at different times in his life, but I will mention some things that I think will motivate why he might have meant it very seriously.
Okay.
First of all, he's deeply formed by Greek civilization and Greek culture. He's a really intense Hellenist. His two main intellectual influences, in terms of his studies, were the ancient Greeks and ancient Buddhism. Yeah, he studied Sanskrit. Um, and in between that, this other influence, which I think was less of an academic influence for him than it was a personal and cultural one, is the Norse mythology as rendered through Wagner's Ring Cycle. Okay, so I think that's really important because he sees the the Greeks have this strong sense of fate, and they don't really know what to do with it, but somehow it never really depresses them as much as it seems like it should to every culture that's come after them. The Norsemen face a similar kind of fate, and their response to it, rather than depression, is it drives them into battle, right? All of the insane Viking conquests of the late 8th, so of the Viking Age, starting in 793 when they sacked Lindisfarne, all of that stuff is driven by go die in battle, right? That's the thing you can do in life that makes sense of the nonsense of it. And fate can't touch you. If you're prepared to die in battle, all fate can do is kill you, you're good to go. So he's seeing those two things. Now, there's one thing that's common to both of those cultures that is related to the eternal recurrence. Aristotle claims that the universe is eternal. And more importantly, Aristotle separately postulates that given infinite time, all possibilities will be actualized. Okay, that's interesting. Really excited the medieval Muslim thinkers, but we'll leave that alone. And also in the ancient Greek astronomy, with Ptolemy and such, this may have come up before. This notion of what is an age. An age is a complete rotation of the heavens. So the amount of time it takes for the stars and planets in the heavens to return to the position that they're in today. And it was postulated that the amount of time it would take to do that was 36,000 years, which is based upon the 360 degrees of a revolution, right? Now, there were some people who believed that when the universe returned to the state that the heavens were in on the first day of existence, that history would start over. These are strong astrological determinists, and so everything that happens on Earth is directly determined what's happening in the heavens. So when what happens in the heavens comes back around again, the same things would happen on Earth again. And so there's an eternal recurrence. History keeps happening over and over again as the heavens keep turning, and because there is no endpoint to that, then that will go on for eternity. So there's the Greeks for you. Now, over on the Norse side, the clearest form of the Norse fate and depression and things like this is Ragnarok, right? Götterdämmerung in German, when all of the gods will die and the world will sink into the ocean and dissolve in fire and ice, and everything that exists will return to the primeval chaos. Now, in both the prose and the poetic Edda, which are the surviving primary source references to this tradition that we have, there's another day after Ragnarok, which looks awfully like Genesis 1, in which a new world is born. Balder comes back to life and becomes the one god for the new humans that are born, and it's Jesus, and everything's great. And that's almost certainly a later layer added on to the story after those folks became Christians. But in the original sense, there's embedded this notion, because there's this ambiguity of, is Ragnarok a future event or a past event? And in the best Norse traditions, it seems as if Ragnarok is both something that has already happened and is to come. And that has sometimes been interpreted cyclically, that the world is born out of the fires of Ragnarok, and it just goes through that cycle over and over again. Okay, there's two of his three major influences that have a cyclical understanding of history there. So that's part of why I think it's quite possible that he either means it very literally, seriously, or that he is at least very tempted to think it seriously.
Interesting. Okay. All right. You convinced me. I buy that. I mean, I think it's a useful psychological tool for him with what he's talking about with this, but I could buy that there's a larger metaphysical
What's
aspect.
crazy for me is I don't understand why it's helpful to him psychologically. His first response to it, I can't get past personally, right? If everything's just going to happen over and over again the same way it always has for eternity, that is about the most terrible secret I can think of. That is one of my versions of hell. It's just the
Right.
same damn thing happening over and over again.
That's right. That's right.
And that's
Waiting
not
in line
cursing,
at
it's a
the
technical term.
waiting in line at the DMV
That's right. That's right.
over and over again.
You get to the front and you realize it's the end. Yeah. But it's funny because Zarathustra feels that at first, and then he has this moment that I can best describe as resignation when he gives in to the idea, and then his sense of it changes to such an extent that he actually sings a hymn in praise of the eternal recurrence. And that's the move I could never make. And this is where like the radical existentialists and secular humanists lose me. This connects to Camus, that the resignation is the virtue of the man living in a meaningless world. That's the good of things. And folks who buy into that, all these Camusians keep trying to tell me, luckily there aren't that many of them anymore, but they keep trying to tell me that that's the ground of joy. And I keep feeling like maybe they fundamentally don't understand what that word means. Like I can only make sense of that if I allow them the Nietzschean transvaluation that what they mean by joy is what I mean by sorrow, and vice versa. In which case, no, thank you. I'm not going to use the language flip. I'm going to continue to call. I think that what I mean by joy is what joy really is, and resignation in this sense of despair, giving in the face of an overwhelming meaninglessness has no part in joy for me. So that's where they lose me.
Right. I'm trying to. So it's interesting as you're talking about that. I'm thinking about the Apostle Paul and some of his letters about suffering, where he would seem so he also, I wouldn't call it resignation, but there is a kind of acceptance, right, for Paul, and in some ways you have a reversal of sort of natural attitudes about certain things, right? So
count it all joy.
Right, count it all joy. I mean, I'm thinking, I think 2 Corinthians, when he's got that whole thing of, well, we were beaten, we were stoned, we were shipwrecked, we were all these things, and those are, he's bragging about those things. He's saying these are good things that happened to us. Even though, I mean, most people, when we would see a list like that, we would think that's terrible.
Yeah.
So it's not as though Paul is a nihilist, but rather he accepts the reality of those things because there is a teleology that, these things sharpen him, that they sanctify him, they push him towards his end. And he also has kind of larger room for obviously the movements of providence. So then what would it mean then, to accept those things as fate if there was no larger purpose?
Right. I mean, that is the thing that separates Paul and Camus and Nietzsche. Is that Paul says, count it all joy when you suffer for the name.
Right.
That prepositional phrase for points that suffering somewhere. The apostles go away rejoicing because they were counted worthy to suffer for the name. That the only reason they can rejoice in these things is because those things are not the end. Because those things are pointed at something else and something higher that gives them a meaning, that transforms their meaning, right? Take that away, and it seems to me those things' meanings don't get transformed. Their meaning is just their existence, just what they are. In which case, it's not hard for me to imagine a human existence so miserable that the person would think that it was better never to have existed than to have existed.
Right.
It's why I've never been able to get on board with that Platonian idea that being is a good. I'm concerned that that's naive in the face of radical human suffering. And so anyway, I think that's the whole point, right? Like it's not a small adjustment from Paul to say, well, you say all this stuff too, but we just don't have that whole for the sake of the name thing that you have. But we can still join you in that rejoicing in these things. And Paul's like, well, then why would you do that? Like, are you masochist? Like, do you think suffering is great? Because it's not, by the way.
Right. Yeah, it is very it is hard to understand where the joy would come from. Other than that, I guess it goes back to that exertion of the self, and so to exert oneself, even despite a negative situation or something, is potentially, I guess, for them still a good, but
So you
yeah,
overcome things.
it's
But
still
that
ultimately meaningless.
so this connects to one of the other things you said that I really wanted to go circle back around to, because there's a tension that I see here in how he counsels us, how Zarathustra counsels us with regard to the Übermensch, the Superman. Um, in the very beginning, when Zarathustra comes down, and after he's done talking with the hermit, and he goes into town, and the people are getting ready to watch this guy walk across a tightrope, and he is talking to them about the Superman, and he says that they should be willing to die in order that the Superman should come forth, right? And so I interpret that to mean it is the only common duty that humanity as a whole has is to produce the Superman, the thing that comes next after us. And that makes good sense to me in terms of the particular nature of the evolutionary framework that's guiding all of this and whatnot, right? The telos of monkeys is humans. The telos of humans is the Superman, which we're calling the Superman, but theoretically the Supermen wouldn't call themselves the Superman. They any more than we call ourselves super monkeys, right? Maybe they call themselves something else, but we don't know what they call them, so we'll call them super us. And so there's this element of self-abnegation where the individual has to be willing not to matter in order that humanity can succeed in bringing forth the Superman. And yet, the Superman is marked by an exceptionally strong will to power that to me is at tension with a willingness to die in order that the Superman come forth. It seems to me that if I'm willing to die in order that the Superman come forth, then I disqualify myself from being the Superman. And that self-disqualification from being the Superman, to me, and maybe I'm reading him wrong, but to me, that's un-Nietzschean,
Mm-hmm.
right? That we should all try to be the Superman to the greatest extent that we can, and one or some of us will succeed in being that, and that's how the he will come forth. So I'm not sure how that recommendation that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one. I'm not sure that that fits with the will to power.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps I don't know. Because you're right. I found that same tension and was kind of wondering what to do with it. I was wondering if maybe at first Zarathustra, like when he tells the people that they need to die, that it was almost more of a description than a prescription. That in effect you will, right? If it's true that there is this Superman and that there is this kind of giving way to, if they really are a Superman, then they'll be able to overcome the opposition of lesser beings, just like in the evolutionary process. The stronger will always sort of survive over the weaker. And so maybe there's a sense of it's inevitable anyways, so you might as well just get over it. But yeah, maybe it's a trap. Maybe it's a way of weeding out those who are not the Supermen. But that is interesting.
Yeah, that's one thought that I had, is that this is a way to get the masses out of the way, to clear the stage for the Superman. Another thought I had is that maybe he doesn't mean that maybe there has to be a kind of, I don't think I can make this work actually, but I was thinking something like maybe there has to be a kind of lack of self-consciousness or self-concern in order to be able to transcend the self and become the Superman. So I know maybe I can make it work actually. If the idea is my love of myself, which is represented by the Schopenhauerian will to life, is one of the things that stands in the way of my overcoming the paltry life I have and transcending into the greater life of the Superman. And so it becomes almost a sort of Christian self-negation where you're dying in order to live, dying to self in order, because it's a false self, that kind of a thing. Maybe. I don't know. I also feel that
Can I say one thing real quick on this point? Yeah. So I
Yeah.
think it's helpful to maybe contrast the difference between the emphasis on the individual versus the emphasis on the corporate here, because again, if you think about how Christians would think about this, right? The individual person exists enmeshed in a larger creation, creation itself is a gift, that the way the world is structured and all these things. And so there's various meanings that are attached to that. So in other words, we should take care of the individual from a corporate level, because the individual is part of the corporate body. And so if you want the corporate body to have dignity, then the individual person has to have dignity. And the two are very much in a sort of a feedback loop. There are, of course, situations in which we have to make tough decisions about how do we work that out. But generally, that's the principle here. But for Nietzsche, there is repeatedly a kind of the masses are discussed as a bad thing. This is they're dirty, they're gross, they're poor, they're sick, they're feeble, all these things, and that's bad. And so their only significance could come from being sort of trampled by the Superman. So there is a kind of, I think you were right, and you pointed this out earlier about freedom being the ethic here. It's not really about the content so much as it is about having the freedom. And I think if that's your case, then you're always going to be in some sort of individualism, which is where I think this Superman ends. And it's why totalitarians love Nietzsche, whether he would have loved them or not, I think, because then the masses are disposable for the great whoever.
The greater good.
Or the greater well,
the greater good of me, Hitler,
greater
right?
person, right? Yeah. The strong man.
Exactly right. Well, that's helpful in terms of thinking about interpreting the weird end of the thing, where in part 4 he faces what's called the last temptation, and the last temptation, and he's told it before it happens, is compassion. The temptation to feel compassion for the Superman is the last temptation that Zarathustra has to overcome. And look, by implication, Zarathustra is one of the Supermen, right? He's either the Superman or the Superman's prophet, something along those lines. And what happens is you have these people come up who have found their way through Zarathustra's teaching, but they aren't properly disciples. They've each found their own way up the mountain, right? And I think that's really important. And he invites them back to his cave. And he goes and he's like, okay, these are Supermen, but they're not the Superman. They're not the one that I was waiting for. We should expect another. So they've made some progress along that path, but they're not quite there yet. And it turns out that these are the ones he's tempted to have compassion for. Why is compassion for the Superman the final sin, especially given that the goal should be to see that the Superman arrive? Well, I think it's precisely, I think the answer, I saw the answer in what you were saying a second ago, that you've got to stay true to your own course, and you just can't be concerned with anybody else's course. The Superman will never come about through communal cooperation. It's going to be a bunch of individuals climbing that mountain individually and leaving other potential Supermen to die, because helping them disqualifies them from self-transcending and becoming the Superman. Yeah. It's kind of, I mean, gosh, we look at the sort of capitalist billionaires, right? I mean, it kind of feels like the mega ultra rich are nailing it.
I was going to say this as you were talking. I immediately started thinking of the show Succession, and the way that their siblings, they should want the family business to succeed, but they're willing to cut each other's throats so that they can ascend up the ladder and eventually take over the company, and they don't really care about anyone else. It's absolutely. There's something certainly about the sort of capitalist ethic, which we'll talk about here in a few months when we do Communist Manifesto, that does really mirror some of this. I mean, Ayn Rand, as I was reading this, I thought a lot about Ayn Rand. You could certainly lift paragraphs from this book and put it in any of her novels, and it would make sense. Yeah. And they're both
insofar as either one makes any sense at all.
They're both equally poorly written.
Oh, there we go again. Okay, so there it is. So you have this claim that this is it's a badly written book, or it's got literary faults. Can you give some content to what the literary vices of this book are?
Well, so I think my problems with this stem from my problems with Nietzsche's larger system of thought. If I agreed with Nietzsche on many of these things, I probably would think this is a good literary product. But I think you don't have really anything by way of character development in a traditional sense. You don't have really anything by way of plot. It's not a very structured plot, or it doesn't feel like a very structured plot. And again, these are all on purpose, right? He wants you to feel kind of like you're in that cyclical, I think, recurring circle of time. I think he doesn't want you to feel like there's a strong beginning, middle, end. I think, I mean, there is there's the Last Temptation and stuff. You were right to point that out, but I don't know. I just feel like I feel like it was written by someone going mad, which it was, and I think the text reflects that, in that it's not organized, at least not in any sort of profound way. I think he thinks he's profound, but I don't think it's actually very profound. So anyway, so that's what I mean when I say it was not a pleasurable read. There are some books that maybe the moral content of the book or the philosophical presuppositions of the book are not something you would agree with, but you can still enjoy the read. I did not feel that way about this.
Yeah. I'm gonna push back, and I'm gonna push back by reading this from the composer Gustav Mahler about this book. He says his Zarathustra was born completely from the spirit of music and is even symphonically constructed. And Nietzsche himself thought that he claimed that it was written after a Wagnerian style, that it should have a sort of operatic structure to it and whatnot. So now I only came across that quote from Mahler today, and I have not had a chance to think back through the book and go back through the book, and I don't think I'm going to try to figure out what would that look like. Like, how would you give content to that claim? But here's a because part of what I hear you saying is there's an aesthetic consequence to the Nietzschean philosophy, that the aesthetic principles that we judge by also stand condemned, or at least stand accused of Nietzsche's charges that we're glorifying the wrong things. And so what he's done is written a book according to the aesthetic principles that are consistent with his philosophy, which we're not going to get on board with. And so you're done, right? And I think it's a really good way to put it. So first of all, let me congratulate you on giving good intellectual grounding to your dislike of the way the book is written. My suspicion, though, is when you first told me that you thought that it was a badly written, but it was a literary disaster, I was very skeptical. That wasn't my impression of it. My sense of it is closer to Mahler's, that there's some sort of structure that makes a kind of artistic sense in here, even though it would require more effort to articulate than I'm willing to give this book. So maybe what we can come down on, you needn't agree with anything actually, but maybe something we could offer as a bit of a middle ground between literary disaster, my interpretation of what you said, not what you said, and literary genius, which is probably what Nietzsche thinks it is that it has a different and unique relationship to aesthetic norms.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think so. And I think that's why I don't like it, right? Is that I don't appreciate the Nietzschean philosophy.
Yeah.
And so his inversion of some of those norms, or the way he plays with them, to me is kind of repulsive.
Yeah.
Just like I find the whole philosophy repulsive. But right. Yes, insofar as it captures his thought, I suppose you could argue, well, yeah, it's actually pretty good, because it he does cast off certain features that would be problematic for his philosophy. So
that's right.
Again, insofar as he's consistent, I appreciate it. I do. Yeah.
I think there's something more, though, because I think that it isn't detethered from the slave morality's aesthetics in the way that I think he's failed actually to detether it, which may be intentional. It may be a way of helping people transition from where they are to where he wants them to be.
He's sort of missionally Superman.
Could be. Or it could be that he failed because those norms are much more deeply grounded than he believes, and he's not capable of throwing them off.
Interesting.
Right. I think that's why I see Mahler coming in, because Mahler is a very tonal composer. He writes incredibly gorgeous stuff. He's a Jew who converts to Christianity. I happen to think his conversion was a legitimate conversion. It wasn't just to get the job at Vienna. And I think that, so I take his recognition of structure in it very seriously.
Okay, I can take that.
So I think that gets to the heart of what I wanted us to talk about this book. I mean, maybe just to sort of to begin to point us towards a close. I hope that it's obvious to the listeners just how much this philosophy is not dead. There is a lot of this stuff, but very few people want to be like full on Nietzschean. Nietzsche probably shouldn't have been a full on Nietzschean, right? But he provides a lot of resources that people can draw from to ground various aspects of the modernist, postmodernist, and whatever we are now ways of approaching the world, including the sort of radical individualism, the perspectivalism, my truth is the only truth that matters. All of these sorts of things. That's all very well spoken to in the character of Zarathustra. Zarathustra is also kind of the perfect and the culmination of the romantic hero, right? The romantic genius who goes up on the mountain and receives revelation and comes back. And that notion of art still controls our understanding of art to this day, that art is this individual thing where you got to see something and then you become the person, the amazing artiste who has seen this and brings it back to humanity, Prometheus casting fire down and all this other sort of thing. And so in a sense, this gathers together romanticism, it gathers together Hegel's philosophy and Schopenhauer and all of these things, and then presents them forward in a way that makes it really easy for modernism and subsequent isms to appropriate. And at this point, it's filtered so much through the water that people who've never read a word of any of the people I just named are still spouting slogans that sound like they heard them listening to Zarathustra.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you see Nietzsche all over. I mean, as I was reading it, I thought there were a number of politicians who might fit the bill for what he's describing as well. I maybe to close, the last thing I want to say is actually about the title character, Zarathustra. We didn't talk about this, but Zarathustra was an historic thinker, writer. It's like Zoroastrianism, which is highly dualistic. Which then, it makes an interesting character for Nietzsche, who is kind of deconstructing those dualisms that have so characterized human experience. And so in this way, he makes a fitting person to represent the evolution into the next stage. He was so caught up in our previous iterations of Zarathustra with these dichotomies that now he has transcended them. And so he makes the titular character then.
Which is super Hegelian, right? The resolution of the thesis and antithesis and the synthesis. And
yes,
that's good. Thanks for bringing that in.
Yes. Well, glad that one's over.
You survived.
We survived, barely. Yes. Well, in notes, the thing we do at the end of every episode where we bring in something from pop culture or some other part of our experience to help us understand the text better. What would you add for your end note there, Junius?
I was paralyzed by this one, and it was not. I'm often paralyzed by the end notes, but sometimes it's because I can't think of anything. This was like I kind of felt like I could name almost anything, and it was, it would sort of fit. I could make a connection, but what I settled on that I think is probably the most Nietzschean movie that is nevertheless not like a really artsy niche kind of thing, because some of those things can be more Nietzschean, is The Watchmen. Which is it's based on a kind of graphic novel, and it's kind of this reflection on it's taking the idea of superheroes and it's taking the transcendence out of it. These aren't these great model people that we should want to be like. They're deeply, deeply flawed. It's their title comes from this notion of who watches the Watchmen, right? Who's going to look after them and make sure they don't become the bad guys. And so it's a long, sprawling movie that I don't really like that much, but I think it is a really good Zarathustrian tale of what it looks like as you see these individuals who have power and who have the will to power and their various gestures at trying to become the Superman.
Good. Yeah. Mine. So I was going to say the first season of True Detective.
Mm.
And I was also considering Batman with Heath Ledger as the Joker. I think that's a very Nietzschean character. But I think I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to say Prometheus and Alien Covenant, I think, are two really helpful demonstrations of some Nietzschean thought.
Yeah.
So I
Nice.
think, and in fact, he actually is playing Wagner as he drops the weapons of mass destruction onto the civilization that he destroys. So I think there is something there. I think David, who's an android,
Mhm.
is sort of an Überman character, and
That's great.
that's what he wants to do. He wants to create, and so to create he has to destroy, and in
Mhm.
destroying he shows himself to be stronger not only than the humans that created him, but the creators of the humans.
Yeah.
And so he really emerges then as this kind of god-like figure. And what does he create? What does the world look like to him? To him it's very beautiful, but it's these xenomorphs that are these kind of optimal killing machines.
Yeah.
So I think that those are pretty solid illustrations of a lot of the themes that we've been talking about today.
Oh, that is outstanding. Well done.
Excellent. Well, our next book I'm looking forward to.
Which one is next? I forgot.
It's Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
we should have a special guest for that one as well. So we're very excited to do that. Very good. Well, we will see you next month, listeners. And in the meantime, keep reading.